The sun is dropping and you have maybe 40 minutes. The wind coming off the ice is dry and constant, and it's already pulling the heat out of your hands. You're standing on an open plain of frozen grass. No forest, no hill to hide behind. Nothing between you and the sky. Your body is fine right now. That's the trap. Cold doesn't announce itself. It works on you slowly, and the real danger starts the second you fall asleep. Because a sleeping body stops shivering properly and stops making excuses for a bad shelter. So here's your only job before dark. Build something. Not a house like you're imagining, something that takes an hour out of whatever this landscape gives you. And this is where most people get the Ice Age completely wrong, because they picture one solution: a cave, a fire, a family huddled on stone. That picture is mostly wrong, and the evidence for it is thin. Ice Age humans built at least 6 completely different kinds of shelter, and the caves were the least important of them. Some of these buildings took a single afternoon. One of them took months, hundreds of bones, and the coordinated labor of an entire group. One of them still had the beds inside it when archaeologists found it, 23,000 years later. And one of them was so big that nobody can figure out how anyone roofed it, which means it might not have been a house at all. By the end of this, you'll know every type of shelter Ice Age people are known to have built, how each one was actually put together, and which one would keep you breathing through a night like this one. Start with the cave, because you need to know why it fails you. Walk into a deep cave in winter, and the first thing you notice is that it isn't warm. It's steady. Deep caves hold a constant, chilly temperature all year, which feels like relief in August and like a stone refrigerator in January. Then there's the geography problem. Caves sit where limestone sits. Most of the Ice Age world is open plain, river valley, and tundra. And out there, the nearest cave might be a 2-week walk away. You can't plan your winter around a feature that doesn't exist where the animals are. And when you dig into the sites that people did use, the living debris almost never sits deep inside. Hearths, tools, food waste, bedding, it all clusters at the mouth, in the daylight, in the first few meters. So if humans were standing at the entrance instead of walking in, what were they actually using? Not a cave, an overhang. In French archaeology, it's called an abri, and it's simply a lip of rock jutting out from a cliff face, sometimes only deep enough to keep the rain off your shoulders. The most famous Ice Age sites in southwest France are these, not caverns. La Madeleine, the shelter that gave the whole Magdalenian period its name, is an overhang above a river. The genius is in the selection. A good abri faces the sun, so the rock soaks up warmth through the day and gives it back slowly at night. It turns its back to the prevailing wind. It sits above the valley floor, high enough to escape the cold air that pools in the bottom after dark, low enough that you're not exposed on the ridge. There's a reason the good spots feel obvious once you're standing in them. Terrain does half the work of a wall, and it costs you nothing to use. Read the ground wrong, and no amount of building saves you. People came back to the good ones for thousands of years. Some have occupation layers stacked meters deep, one generation of ash on top of the last. But an overhang gives you a ceiling and one wall. On a night like tonight, the wind doesn't come from above. So what did they hang across the front? They built a wall. At rock shelter sites, excavators keep finding things that don't belong to nature. Lines of stone blocks laid along the drip line. Holes and slots where posts once stood. Slabs arranged in arcs that cut a big open shelter into a small closed room. That's the whole trick. You're not trying to heat a cliff. You're trying to make a pocket small enough that 4 bodies and 1 fire can warm the air inside it. And then you seal that pocket with hides stretched across a frame. Which means the rock shelter isn't really a natural shelter at all. It's a building with 1 free wall and 1 free roof. And that reframes the entire question. If people were carrying the hides, the poles, and the skills with them, then they were never dependent on rock in the first place. So what did they put up when there was no cliff for 100 kilometers? The simplest shelter in the Ice Age toolkit is a screen. You set a curved barrier on the windward side, weighted at the base, angled to throw the wind up and over you. Behind it, you make your fire. The screen doesn't warm you, it stops moving air from stripping the heat off your skin. And moving air is what kills, because it never lets the thin, warm layer against your body sit still long enough to protect you. You can build this out of brush, bone, hide, stacked turf, or heaped snow. It takes one person an hour. The screen also teaches you the rule that governs every shelter after it. Heat leaves a body 4 ways, and 3 of them are made worse by an open plane. So the first structure you ever build isn't a room, it's a decision about which direction the danger is coming from. The problem is what it leaves behind. Almost nothing. A windbreak rots, blows away, or melts, and after 20,000 years, there's no wall to excavate. So for a long time, archaeologists could only find the shelters made of stone and bone. The light ones were invisible. Then, someone worked out how to see a building that isn't there. The method sounds impossible, and it's beautifully simple. You map the rubbish. At the open-air camp of Poncevent in northern France, reindeer hunters left their gear scattered exactly where they dropped it. Excavators recorded the position of every flint chip, every bone splinter, every scrap of burnt fat across huge open surfaces. Patterns appear. Around each hearth, there's a dense ring of small waste, the stuff that falls between your knees while you work. Further out, there's a band of bigger pieces, the things you toss over your shoulder. And in some units, there's a hard edge, a line where the debris simply stops and then starts again beyond it. Nothing in nature makes a straight edge like that. A wall does. The finds are the shadow of a tent that rotted away. Even better, broken flints can be refitted like a puzzle, and when 2 halves of the same stone sit on opposite sides of a camp, you can see people moving between shelters. If you're enjoying pulling these forgotten homes back out of the dirt, subscribe now, because the next shelter came with a stone floor and a fire big enough to change how we think about Ice Age life. At Gonnersdorf, on the Rhine in Germany, people did something you wouldn't expect from hunters who were supposed to be constantly on the move. They laid a floor. Flat slate slabs, hauled in and fitted together into large, circular, and roughly trapezoidal surfaces, several meters across, with hearths set into the middle. Some of those slabs carry engravings, and the paving survives where everything else has gone. A paved floor is a serious statement. It's heavy, it takes hours, and it only pays you back if you're staying long enough to care about a dry, level surface underfoot. Around the paving sit rings of larger stones. Those aren't decoration either. Drop a stone ring along the edge of a hide cover, and you've pinned the skirt down so the wind can't get under it and lift the whole thing off you. That's the difference between a tent and a kite. But that camp holds a clue about who was inside those big tents, and it isn't a family. The stone tools at Gonnersdorf didn't all come from nearby. Flint at the site traces back to sources in different regions, some of them far apart, arriving in the same camp at the same time. Groups were converging here from separate territories, and the structures they left behind are among the larger Magdalenian tents known, with substantial hearth arrangements at the center rather than a single small fire. Think about what that means for the building. A shelter for one family can be small and mean. A shelter that has to hold visitors needs floor space, a fire big enough for a crowd, and a surface that doesn't turn to mud when 20 people are standing on it. So some of these tents weren't just protection. They were the room where separate groups met, traded, arranged marriages, and swapped news that could keep you alive next season. Still, a floor and a wall leave you sitting on top of the coldest air in the landscape. Somebody figured out how to get underneath it. In Siberia, near the Angara River, sits the site of Malta. The dwellings there weren't set on the ground. They were set into it, dug down roughly 0.5 meter to 70 centimeters, so the sleeping floor sat below the surface of the plain. The walls went up from that pit using heavy animal bone and stone slabs. Reindeer antler and mammoth bone framed the roof, and hide went over the top. Sink a floor, and the ground does the work for you. Below the surface, the earth stays far steadier than the air. The wind passes over your head instead of against your body, and every gust that would have hit a wall now hits dirt. At Malta, there wasn't one of these. Excavation traced around 15 dwellings across the site, spread along a river terrace, which starts to look less like a camp and more like a village. So, who was doing all this digging in frozen ground with no metal? Now, the strangest building of the entire Ice Age. In 1965, a farmer in Mizhorich in central Ukraine was deepening his cellar and hit a mammoth jawbone. He kept digging. Under his yard were the collapsed remains of 4 structures made almost entirely from mammoth. They're modest in footprint, roughly 12 to 24 square meters inside, but they're built from hundreds of bones, and the arrangement isn't random. Heavy skulls go down first as the foundation ring, set with the sockets facing outward. Jawbones get stacked in interlocking rows like scales, each one holding the next. Long bones and shoulder blades fill the wall. Tusks curve over the entrance and brace the frame. A hearth sits near the center of the floor. Hide went over the frame, and earth was probably packed against the base to seal the joins. Recent dating puts the largest of them in the coldest stretch of the last glaciation, roughly 18,000 years ago. But the walls aren't the reason Mezherich matters. It's what people left on the floor. Among the finds from the site is a piece of mammoth tusk with a pattern cut into it that has been read as a schematic map of the surrounding area. There's a mammoth skull marked with red ochre, painted in dots and lines, which has been interpreted as an instrument. There are ornaments of bone and ivory, hunting gear, and pits packed with tools, bone fragments, and ash. None of that belongs to people passing through in a panic. Decorated objects take time. A map means somebody was thinking about the land beyond the doorway and explaining it to someone else. So when you picture yourself inside one of these, don't picture survival grimly endured in a bone igloo. Picture a low-domed room, warm enough to sit up in, firelight on ivory, a floor scattered with the mess of ordinary evenings, which raises the question that has bothered archaeologists for 60 years. Where do you get hundreds of mammoth bones? You do not get them by killing a herd. That was the old assumption, and the evidence keeps pushing back on it. At Kostenki in Russia, researchers ran dating and biomolecular work on the mammoth remains from the big structure there. 2 of the jaws came back centuries older than the rest of the material, hundreds of years older, which is not possible for animals killed in one event. That means the builders were collecting. Some bone came from hunting, and plenty came from the landscape itself, from natural death sites where carcasses piled up along rivers and in gullies. The testing also showed the mammoths were mostly female, which points at herds rather than lone bulls. So picture the real work, not a hunt, a haul. A single mammoth skull is a crushing weight, and every piece had to be found, judged, lifted, and carried, then fitted by people who understood which bone could take a load and which would split. And Mezherich is not a freak, not even close. Circular structures made of mammoth bone turn up across a huge sweep of the Ice Age world, through Ukraine and Western Russia and into Moravia and Poland, with roughly 70 of them known on the Central East European plain. They share a recipe, a ring of heavy bone at the base, pits dug around the outside, hearths in and around the floor. Different valleys, different centuries, same solution arrived at again and again. Try to price one of these buildings in labor and the numbers get uncomfortable. Every heavy bone has to be located somewhere in the valley, judged, dragged, and lifted into position. And the big ones are far beyond what one person can move alone. This is days of coordinated work by a group that has to keep hunting, cooking, and minding children the whole time it's building. That's what separates a shelter from a building tradition. Somebody was taught this. A person who had never seen a tree taller than a bush knew which bone goes at the bottom, how to lock a row of jaws so it doesn't slide, and how many people it takes to lift a skull into place. Now hold that thought, because one of these rings breaks every rule. The structure found at Kostenki 11 is a ring 12.5 meters across, around 40 feet. Inside and around it, researchers counted the remains of dozens of mammoths, including 64 skulls and 51 lower jaws, along with bones of horse, reindeer, bear, wolf, and fox. Radiocarbon work dates it to about 25,000 years ago, at the onset of the harshest phase of the last ice age, making it one of the oldest of these bone circles on the Russian plain. Flotation of the sediment pulled out charcoal, burnt bone, and tiny fragments of stone toolwork. So fires burned there, and people worked there. Soft plant tissue turned up too, from roots and tubers. Here's the part that stops you. Nobody can explain how you'd roof a span that wide with the materials available. And the intensity of everyday debris looks low for a place people lived in for long stretches, which forces an uncomfortable idea about a building we've always called a house. So if it wasn't a home, what was it? Look at the ground just outside the ring and you find the answer nobody talks about. Pits. Big ones, dug around the perimeter, packed with mammoth bone. Those pits are the part of the shelter you'd never draw. In a frozen landscape, a hole in the ground is a store. You can pack meat into it and let the cold hold it. You can stack bone in it and burn that bone later. You can dump waste in it so it isn't sitting in your living space attracting things with teeth. Some of these pits may simply be the quarry, the place the loose sediment came from that was heaped against the walls. The Big Kostenki Circle may have been a work site, a cache, a place a group returned to when the plain froze solid, or something with meaning we can't reach. Not every circle of bone was somebody's bedroom, which leaves one thing unexplained. Why here? Why this exact patch of frozen plain? The decision that matters most gets made before a single bone is lifted. These sites cluster on river terraces and valley edges, raised above the water but close to it, on the routes animals use. That's not a view. That's your food walking past your door, and your building material accumulating in the same valley. At Kostenki, one suggestion for why people and mammoths both concentrated there is a natural spring, water that would have kept flowing through the winter when everything else in the landscape had turned to ice. Think about what that solves. In deep cold, drinking water is a daily crisis because melting snow costs you fuel and eating it costs you body heat. Camp beside water that refuses to freeze, and you've removed one of the ways the season kills you. But the houses raise a question you'd only think of once you're standing in one. How many people were squeezing inside? The floors are tiny by our standards. The Mezherych structures run about 12 to 24 square meters. The Siberian dwellings measure roughly 3.5 to 8 meters across. That's a bedroom, not a hall. And it's deliberate, because every extra cubic meter of air inside is space your bodies have to heat. A person at rest gives off steady warmth, and a small sealed room full of people plus one fire becomes genuinely livable while the air outside stays lethal. Cut the volume in half and you have the work. That's why these buildings are low and domed rather than tall and square, and why the doorway is small. So sleeping shoulder to shoulder wasn't a hardship they put up with. It was part of the heating system. Which brings up the one thing that could still take the whole shelter down. You can't burn a mammoth bone with a spark and hope. Out on the mammoth steppe, firewood is the scarce resource, and it's the one your survival is built on. Bone burns. Fat inside it makes it burn hot and long, which is exactly what you want in a landscape stripped of trees. But bone is stubborn to light, and the evidence from these sites shows both things together, charcoal and burnt bone in the same deposits. You start with wood, brush, dung, or dry grass, and once the fire is fierce, you feed it bone, and the bone carries the night. That's why fire was carried and guarded, rather than casually made. Losing it inside a high dome in a place with no forest isn't an inconvenience, and it introduces a danger the walls create. A fire inside a sealed skin house makes smoke and carbon monoxide, and both settle in with you. Every one of these dwellings needed a hole and an airflow, A vent at the peak, a gap under the skirt, drawing air in low and pushing bad air out high. Seal your shelter perfectly, and it becomes the thing that kills you. And there's one more thing this house needs that no excavation can hand you. Every shelter in this story ends at the same missing layer: the cover. Bone gives you a frame. Antler gives you rafters. Stone gives you a floor and a set of anchors. None of that stops wind on its own. What seals a frame is hide, and hide almost never survives, which is why the covering is the part reconstructions have to argue for rather than dig up. That skin is also the most expensive component you own. Each one has to be taken off an animal, scraped, worked soft, and stitched to the next. And a dome large enough for a family swallows a lot of them. It's heavy to carry, and it's the first thing you'd take with you when the group moved on. Then there's the gap you can't avoid: the doorway. It's the weak point in the wall, kept low and narrow, sometimes braced by tusks, and covered by a flap you can drop behind you. So which shelter would actually get you through tonight? Hold that, because someone deliberately built a fire inside a hut that was hot enough to bake stone. At Dolny Vestonice in Moravia, one hut stands apart from the rest of the settlement. Its floor was cut into a slope. The edge was reinforced with a wall of earth and stone, and post holes in that wall show where the roof supports stood. In the middle of the floor was a kiln, a domed fire structure built to reach the kind of heat that turns wet clay into ceramic. The people there weren't making pots. They were firing figurines and small animal shapes out of local clay mixed with ground bone, thousands of years before pottery exists anywhere as a technology. Notice what this tells you about the settlement. A separate structure, on the edge, built around a dangerous heat source, away from where people slept. That is zoning. That's a group that thought about which building does what. So if a hut could be a workshop, what did the ones people actually slept in look like on the inside? For that, you go somewhere the Ice Age doesn't usually take you: to the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The camp at Ohalo II was drowned by the lake and buried in mud for 23,000 years. Water and silt kept out the oxygen, and everything that normally vanishes survived. 6 huts, oval and kidney-shaped, built from brush and branches, with hearths outside them on the ground. Something else survived too: the beds. On one hut floor, excavators found bundles of grass stems laid out in a repeated pattern around the edges of the room, covered with a thin layer of packed clay. Sleeping places, prepared and arranged in a shelter that had a deliberate floor rather than bare dirt. There's a detail that makes it feel painfully human. The huts burned more than once, and each time people rebuilt on the same footprint, which is why the excavation found stacked floors, one over the other, in the same spot, which tells you the wall was never the most important part of the shelter. The ground is a heat thief, and it never stops. Air steals warmth slowly. Cold earth pressed against your body pulls it away far faster, all night, silently, from the parts of you that are already touching it. You can survive a night with a bad roof. You will not survive many nights lying flat on frozen dirt. That's what the grass bedding at Ohalo II is really evidence of. Not comfort, insulation. A thick, springy layer full of trapped air between a sleeping body and the cold, held down and kept tidy so it stays where it's needed. Everything else follows the same logic once you see it. The slate paving that keeps damp out, the sunken floors set below the wind, the packed earth surfaces at bone dwellings, the layer of clay pressed over the bedding to hold it in place. Ice Age shelter isn't about the shape you see from outside. It's about the surface you lie on. And this raises a question people rarely ask out loud. Were our species the only ones doing this? At Moldova in the Dniester Valley, there's a layer with no modern humans in it at all. The stone tools are Mousterian, the toolkit of Neanderthals, and the layer is dated beyond 44,000 years old. Inside it, excavators recorded a roughly circular accumulation of mammoth bone, around 8 meters at its widest, with a scatter of hearths in and around it, along with tens of thousands of stone artifacts and evidence of butchery and tool-making. It's been read as a dwelling base or a windbreak, with a covering of hide or wood over a bone foundation. The interpretation is argued over, and honest researchers say so, because a pile of bone can form in more ways than one. But whichever way that debate lands, the location is the point. Moldova is out in the open, in a valley without much timber, which means the people there were solving the same problem as everybody else in this story, with the same raw material, tens of thousands of years earlier. So how did any single group know which shelter to build? They didn't build one. They built to a calendar. Follow a group through a year, and the architecture changes shape with the weather. In the warm months, when you're moving with the herds, the answer is fast and light. A screen, a hide over poles, a hearth in the open, gone in a morning. As the cold closes in, the investment goes up. You come off the exposed ground. You choose the sheltered terrace, the sunny overhang, the river bend where the animals concentrate. You put in the floor. You haul the heavy material. That's why Mezherich has been read as a winter place. Structures like that only make sense if you're going to sit still and let the worst of the year pass over you. And the recent dating work there says something unexpected about how those bone domes were used, which cuts against decades of assumption. New radiocarbon work on the largest Mezherich structure puts its construction and use in the coldest window of the last glaciation, and the analysis suggests the actual occupation was short, possibly a single stay or a few visits spread across a long span of time. Read that again in survival terms. Hundreds of mammoth bones, hauled and stacked and fitted for a shelter that might have been used for one brutal season. That's not wasteful. That's a decision. The cost of building it was less than the cost of being outside without it. When conditions crashed, you spent everything you had on the structure that got your family through. And if the group moved on afterwards, the bones stayed standing on the plain, waiting. Which means these things were sitting in the landscape, empty, ready. And that changes what a shelter even is. Look at where the buildings sit relative to each other, and another layer appears. At Mezherich, the 4 structures cluster, with pits and work areas around them. At Malta, the dwellings run in a line along the terrace. At Ohalo, the huts sit in a group, with hearths out in the open between them and a rubbish area off to one side. At Dolny Vestonica, there's a hut set apart for firing clay. None of that is accidental. Cluster the buildings and each one shields the next from wind. Keep the fires and the mess outside the sleeping space. Put the dangerous work at the edge. Leave a shared area in the middle where people cook and nap and talk. That's a settlement plan, made by people with no writing and no surveying, repeated across thousands of kilometers of frozen ground. And yet, the list you've just been given is almost certainly incomplete. Everything that survives from the Ice Age survives for a reason. Bone lasts. Stone lasts. Anything soft only lasts when a lake buries it in mud or a cave seals it from air. So think about what that filter removes. A shelter built from branches and bark in a wooded valley leaves you a stain in the soil at best. A structure of packed snow leaves you nothing at all, not one trace, because in spring it becomes water. That's not a license to invent buildings nobody has found. It's the opposite. It's a warning about the shape of the evidence. And it's why the light, fast, temporary shelters in this story had to be reconstructed from patterns in scattered rubbish instead of from walls. The 4 great bone circles under a Ukrainian village exist because mammoth is nearly indestructible. The homes of everybody who lived where the mammoths weren't have mostly gone quiet. And once you've slept in one, the shape stops looking primitive. It looks solved. So after all of it, What's the answer for tonight? Standing on that open plain with the light going, none of the famous answers help you. There's no cliff to tuck under and no time to haul bone. So you do what the evidence says people did on nights exactly like this one. You get off the low ground, where the cold air settles. You cut into the earth if you can, or you put a screen between yourself and the wind if you can't. You make the space small. You pile dry grass under your body, and you keep the fire inside, with a gap for the smoke. That's the shelter that keeps you breathing tonight. And the mammoth houses, the paved tents, the sunken Siberian rooms, and the brush huts by the lake are all the same instinct, with more time and better material. There was never one Ice Age shelter. There was a system, and the system is what kept you alive. It runs the same way at every site in this story. Choose ground that isn't a trap, out of the wind and off the valley floor. Build the smallest enclosed space your group can fill with body heat. Get insulation between you and the earth. Put fire inside it and give the bad air somewhere to go. Anchor the cover so the wind can't take it. Then match the effort to the season. Cheap and portable when you're moving, expensive and heavy when the cold sets in for months. Rock, brush, hide, bone, antler, slate, packed clay, and dug earth were just what was lying around. The idea underneath was identical every time. Nothing about that is guesswork dressed up as science. It's what the floors, the fires, and the rubbish actually show. And here's what that idea actually was. Ice Age humans invented the inside.
The sun is dropping, and you have maybe 40 minutes. The wind coming off the ice is dry, condensed, and it's already pulling the heat out of your hands. You are standing on an open plain of frozen glass, not forest, no hill to hide behind, nothing between you and sky. Your body is fine right now. That's a trap. Could not announce itself. It work on you slow and real danger. Start and second fall. Abuse sleep body stop. Shivering properly and stop making excuse for a bad shelter. So here your only job before dark. Build something, not a house, like you are imagining something that takes an hour out of weather. This landscape gives you, and this is where most people get the ice is completely wrong because they are picture one solution: a cave, a fire, a family, and laid on the stone. That picture is the most wrong, and the evidence for it is thin ice. Each humans build and the least completely different kinds of shelter, and caves were the least important of them. Some of these buildings took a single afternoon, one of the took months, hundred of bones and collide labor of an entire groups. One of the still had the beds inside when archaeologists found it. Hmm, available.